Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be continuing on with my 2021 wrap-up videos, and we're going to be talking about the most disappointing books I read in 2021. For me, especially in 2021, I found that there was quite a bit of a difference between the worst and the most disappointing. Sometimes they come hand in hand, but for the most part, like a lot of these books, I don't think are awful books. I don't think are the worst book. I just had an issue with them for some reason, which I will explain. So to start off, let's discuss Parable of the Sower, which I've put in 10th place. These are very loosely ranked. I feel quite strongly towards the books I've ranked in my best and worst list of 2021, but here everything's quite loosely ranked. Now, this book, not bad. Like I said, my biggest thing with this book and why it didn't personally work for me is because it's told in like journal entries. It's set in this world where it is in the future, and it's in a time where we're short of water, where disease and war has impacted so many. We follow our protagonist at the start of this book, who lives in a compound sort of community. Shortly into the story, her life and her compound is interrupted by all the chaos that is happening in the world, and she finds herself sort of on the road. It's a story about living in a world that is collapsing and how to find faith and hope and deal with the circumstances that the main character is in. I loved the theme. Octavia E. Butler uses sci-fi and fantasy to explore themes in really interesting ways. She talks a lot about racism, a lot about sexism. In here there's a lot on society, particularly what happens when society collapses, or society as we know it collapses. It talks a lot about environmentalism, and there are really strong religious themes in here as well. Basically what's happening is, while the main character in here is writing kind of like journal entries, she's also writing basically a new Bible, trying to find faith and hope in a really like difficult and dark time. I just do not like journal entries. I find it really hard to get invested in characters in that way, because I feel like it puts up a bit of a wall between you and the characters. Other than that, I did really enjoy this book. I think I gave it like 3.35 stars, so I still rated it quite highly and I would still recommend it, but I think ultimately the narration choice was disappointing, and I didn't love it as much as I wanted to, especially because I have read another book by hers that I gave 5 stars. Coming in 9th place is The Bone Shard Daughter. Again, narration style really does make or break a story for me, and this is the case with this book. This is a book where I had issues with the POVs. Like, there was just multiple POVs. Some were told in first person, some were told in second person. It was just too much for me. This story essentially follows multiple characters. The main character, I would say, is Lynn, who is the Emperor's daughter, who's trying to prove her worth to her father and study magic. Her father, the Emperor, has ruled all these different islands in his empire for many years, and he's able to maintain his rule and his power through his magic, where he is able to make animal constructs using his magic. And a lot of these little animals that he's made, they're like spies, so he's always been able to be informed quickly if there are traitors or if something he is against happens. Then we also follow Jovis, who is a smuggler who is trying to track down his missing wife, and then we follow a couple of other characters. I did not like some of the POVs because there were 2 POVs in particular I felt like never served their own story. They were always there to serve the other character's story. So overall the plot was very unevenly divided between the characters, and the characters that didn't have their own story to really serve, I thought didn't have much characterization either. Like, I knew their setup, but I didn't know anything else about them beyond that. I felt like the story was very disrupted by how it was told. Yeah, ultimately this was quite disappointing. There was just quite a few like issues with the structure and choices of how the story was told that I couldn't overlook what was done, and also it just impacted my enjoyment. In 8th place is a very well loved book, I feel, which is why I had fairly high expectations going into this, and I was disappointed. And that is My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. This was my first Grady Hendrix, and I was really hoping to enjoy this so much more that I would want to go and pick up his other books immediately, and I did not. I have not read anything else by him since. I think I will eventually, just I need time. The title of the book tells you a lot about the story. We have two best friends. Abby is the main character, and it's her best friend Gretchen that gets possessed by a devil at the beginning of the book, and then Gretchen starts acting out of character and things kind of get a little bit more dangerous as the story goes along, and it leads to Abby finding a way how to get her Gretchen back through an exorcism. What I did not like about this was how Mean Girls it was. When Gretchen is first possessed and she starts acting out of character, she is trying to get her friends' boyfriends to cheat with her. She is trying to promote really unhealthy like diets, and there's a little bit like fat phobia going on, but she's just very bitchy and petty. It's just Mean Girls-esque, and a lot of the book is about that, and then towards the second half it gets a lot more like serious and dangerous and more horror-esque, and I just felt very uncomfortable while reading this, having a middle-aged man writing about these teenage girls being like bitchy. Like, that was the whole book. There was nothing else really happening. Obviously, since you know this is about an exorcism and you know that this book is about someone being possessed, there was nothing going on. There was no lead up or build up, and it just didn't have any payoff for me. So yeah, this just was not for me. I don't understand the hype. I know a lot of people love this, but I personally think it's overhyped. Yeah, no. Thanks. In 7th place is A Vow So Bold and Deadly. This is book 3 in the Cursebreakers trilogy. Book 1 is The Curse So Dark and Lonely, and book 1 is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I friggin' loved book 1. It was one of my favorite reads of the year it came out, I think back in 2019, and I personally think that this should not have been a series. I think the story should have ended with book 1 and it should have been a standalone. It was so dragged out from book 2. However, I did enjoy book 2 more than I enjoyed this final book. Some of my issues with this series is I do think that there were too many characters added after book 1. But my main issue with this last book in particular was nothing really happened. There was like issues and sort of conflicts happening on the side, but there was never any big build up to them. There was never any big battle or resolution. It felt so unsatisfying and so useless. Everything that happened, nothing happened. Like, it didn't lead anywhere. I know Bridget Kemmerer is primarily a contemporary author, and I think this kind of reflected here because a lot of the conflict was to do with like miscommunication. It just didn't make for a very entertaining story, and I really thought that the author was sort of clutching at straws to keep the plot going. I also got quite annoyed because the prince slash beast character we meet in book 1, he has a lot of character development in book 1. He sort of goes through the same character development in this final book, and it just felt like we backtracked. It felt like we'd been there and now we're backtracking, and I hate it when characters sort of have a character develop a certain way, then they undo that character development just to redo it, and that happened here. No, thank you. The 6th most disappointing book I read in 2021 was The Winter of the Witch. Now, this book, as well as the second book, The Girl in the Tower, I found both quite disappointing. I did a read-along at the very beginning of the year, so like a year ago now, with Meg from Meg with Books, who hosted it, and we read this entire trilogy together, and I quite enjoyed book 1. However, the sequel and this final book I found quite disappointing. I think this is one of the cases with this book. It's gorgeous. Like, the writing is gorgeous. It's going to be for a lot of people, but it was not for me. A lot of my issues sort of stem from how It is very fantastical, but I think a lot of the ways the plot moves forward and a lot of the choices with how the plot and conflict is resolved is very historical base rather than like fantasy base. In book 1 we are introduced to Vaskia as a very young girl who can talk to spirits and is very connected to the magical side of the world. It is set in a time in Russia where women who are different and women who are more free thinkers and not as confined to the sort of ways of men or men's expectations of this time are really outcasted and are treated really awfully. And Vaskia is one of these women. She is like, from the time we see her as a young girl, she's very outspoken, she's different, she isn't a woman of this time. This story is about the cost of that. It's actually quite delightful because it does start off about her family being very protective of her and how she is different, but how she grows up and has to end up protecting herself because it gets beyond what her family is able to protect, like who she is. What annoyed me and made me quite disappointed about this last book was there were these really interesting, fascinating, well fleshed out villains in this story. There's like 2 in particular, and I thought they were so well crafted, these characters. There was so much build up in the danger they both possessed, and the threat they were to Vaskia was so intense, but they ended up like getting basically like written off. Like the whole build up was so unsatisfying with how these 2 characters ended, and then the final battle in here is completely unrelated to the 2 villains. I did read the author's note after reading this book. The author said that she always knew she was going to end this series at this battle. It is a real historical battle that happened, and that was where she always ideally saw this series ending. I just thought it was so out of place. Like it just felt so chucked in there, and I was like, why do we just lead to this like random battle? So there were a couple times like things like that just happened. I can still see a lot of people really loving this story though, and it was just kind of my preference because I'm a much more fantasy based reader than I am a historical based reader, so I think some people will not care about those choices, but I was quite unsatisfied, unfortunately. I'm going to leave a link to the live show where I discuss this book because we talk all about this book with spoilers in that live show that we did on Meg's channel, and it has been basically a year since I've read this now, so I'm sure I had other complaints, but I think I gave it 2 stars. In 5th place on this list is Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson. Okay, so a little bit of a confession. In 2020, I filmed my most disappointing books and my worst books of 2020, and I never uploaded that video. But Oathbringer, the book before Rhythm of War, was on that list, and it was my most disappointing book of 2020. I can't remember if it was my most disappointing or my worst. It was definitely most disappointing. I can't remember if I combined them though. Anyway, we're never gonna know. I wanted to talk about this book here because I still continue to find this series disappointing. I loved the first 2 books. I had so much love for the first 2 books to the point where I thought the series was going to be a new all-time favorite, but then once I'd read Oathbringer, I was not so sure of that anymore. I never know how to give a synopsis for this series because it is just a huge epic fantasy series. There's war, there's magic, there's all these different characters. Something I think Brandon Sanderson's done so well with the structure of this series is each book has a central character. There's multiple POVs, but one book will have a central character that you kind of focus on. You see that character present day, but you also get a backstory of that character. So you do have 2 timelines, a second timeline of the past sort of spread throughout, and I think it was just such a good way to keep you invested and to keep the story flowing. I really liked how he did it because I think in these big epic fantasies it's so easy to kind of lose yourself in all the characters and not be able to keep track and also struggle with investment, but I think having central characters was a great choice. However, when it came to Oathbringer, one of the main reasons why I disliked it so much was it did follow my least favourite character, Delanar. He was a character who I wasn't a fan of prior to going into Oathbringer, and I liked him even less by the end of Oathbringer, which I know if you look at the fandom, that is a very unpopular opinion. I just don't get his hype. I just don't get him. So I was sort of hoping maybe because there was going to be less of Delana in this book, Reason for War, perhaps my love will be rekindled for this series. It was not. I've just grown too detached. I do think there is an issue with character development at this point in the series. I think that the way the world and the plot and the magic system has developed, that characters have not kept up with that, and that we keep backtracking and having the same character development just continuously happening for multiple characters. At this point, it just feels very redundant and I'm kind of bored. So I'm just kind of sad. I want there to be more character-wise. I do plan to read the final book in this era of the series since there's only one book to go, but overall this series has ended up being quite disappointing for me. The fourth most disappointing book of 2021 is The Jasmine Throne. I was really looking forward to this because Empire of Sand, also by the same author, I adored and read much earlier on in the year, and I was really anticipating this release, and it did not live up to the hype for me. In this, we have a princess who has been exiled by her brother, and she's being kept in this temple, and there is a maidservant there, and that is who our main character is essentially, and these two sort of form a relationship. I think the plot of this was really messy. There were way too many POVs, way too many unnecessary POVs. I thought it was just going to be at first the princess and the maidservant's POV that we follow, but there are so many POVs, so many random ones I don't think we needed, and they were all told in first person. I do not like multiple POVs where they're told in first person. I think it's just a terrible combination. Like, it should be forbidden. Book was all set up, but then there was no development from that setup. I didn't get the romance. I didn't get the politics. I didn't get the magic. Even the conflict. Like, this is so convoluted. I really struggled with this book, honestly, to grasp what was happening and to make sense of it. It was just because the way it was told was honestly all over the place. And I was really disappointed. I'm still really disappointed. In third place is The Serpent's Curse by Lisa Maxwell. I loved book 1 in this series. Again, it was another favourite that I think just went downhill after a couple of books. The authors just added in way too many characters. With each book, she seems to be adding in 5 characters, and we're getting the POV from those characters. The main story and the main plot that we've been following from book 1 in this third book is completely lost because there's just so many stories, so many things going on, and it's too much. It's too much. In this first book, we are following Esther, who is a girl who can time travel, and she's also a thief. So she travels back in time, steals objects, but she does sometimes need help of like items to travel back to certain periods, or like not to certain periods, but to travel back a certain length. At the beginning of this book, she travels back 100 years or so to the early 1900s, and she finds herself stuck there because the object she uses to help her get there she kind of loses when she arrives. So she's stuck in the early 1900s, but she went to that time because she wants to find this lost magic book. It is set in New York, and it's this world where magic exists, and there are people who have all sorts of magical abilities, so like Esther, and everyone kind of has their own like magical ability, but those who have magic cannot leave New York. There's a barrier. I loved it just for the cast of characters. It really does remind me of The Diviners, just the setup of the story. This third book, like I said, just way too many characters at this point. It's gotten to the point where it's hard to get invested because there's just so much going on. Obviously, there are characters you prefer over some other characters, so it's always a little bit of a drag to read certain chapters from characters you might not be a fan of. I also did have an issue in this book with the villains. It seems to be that with each book we're getting a new villain, and I don't like it when books do that. I feel like it's just kind of trying to push the story to go longer than it should. And it's just too much at this point, to the point where I'm just like, can we just move on? I'm not caring as much as I used to. I'm not as invested as I was, which is sad, which is really sad. And also why it's on this list. Okay, down to the top 2. This second book though was actually originally in like 8th or 9th place. But as I was doing my notes for this video, I decided it needed to be bumped up because I realized how disappointed I truly am for this book. And that is, unfortunately, She Who Became the Sun. I gave this 3 stars, so I didn't even rate this just that lowly. This book follows a peasant orphan girl who, when her brother dies, she takes his identity and then lives her life as a boy and a man. She lives amongst the monks and is raised as a sort of novice. It's set in China it starts off when the Mongols rule, and then after the fall of their dynasty is sort of where we're leading up to in the story. We see this character's sort of significant role in that. Now, I did not like this main character. I did not like any of the main characters. I wanted to like them. I like the setup. So basically there's a sapphic relationship with this main character and one of the other main characters. I loved their setup, but the actual characters I thought had no on-page chemistry. I did not understand how they came to have such a deep connection with one another. Like, I didn't see it, I didn't read it, you know. I thought that the way the secondary characters were written and their relationships and conflicts and all of that was so much more better than what the actual main character was written like. I was so much more invested in them, which was just so disappointing because I wanted to love this so much. I also thought that the story dragged for a lot and nothing was really happening until the last 100 to 50 pages where shit just like hit the fan. It was a very slow and tiresome build up to that. There was a fair bit of things in this book where things were happening for convenience. It was a struggle to get invested in this main character's story because she never had to really try that hard to get where she wanted to get to. She raised to power and strength just so easily. Yeah. This is definitely more disappointing than I thought it was when I first finished it. I've just realised. Oh wow, kind of sad for me. Okay, so the most disappointing book of the year. Fool's Errand by Robin Hogg. Just kind of this trilogy, not really this book alone. I just was not a fan of certain plot things that happened. This book is going to be very hard to talk about because of how far into the series this book as well as like the trilogy is, and I don't want to say spoilers because it's so easy to spoil this book, but basically what happens in Assassin's Quest was quite undone in this series and I was annoyed. I was not happy. I also thought with this book, literally half the books took its time like recapping what happened in the original trilogy, which I don't think was necessary. It was very dragged out. Maybe we could have had a quick like summary at the beginning of the book. That would have been nice, you know, save us a few hundred pages to read. But no. I just did not like where this went. We did not need to bring certain characters back. They were good gone. I was happy with them gone. Overall, I still really liked this series and this book in particular. Like, I still gave it 3 stars. Robin Hogg has become a comfort author for me, which I feel like I've said a million times by now. I find her books so easy to consume and I still have overall a really pleasant time reading them. But there were just choices I do not agree with, that I do not think should have happened. So that's why this is here, because I was like, damn. Yeah, just this trilogy, I'm just like, choices. No. Anyway, this video is so long and I have the worst pins and needles, so I'm going to end it here. Let me know if you disagree with any of my thoughts. I'll be very interested to hear if you do. And thank you so much for watching. I hope you're enjoying whatever you're currently reading at the moment. And I hope to see you next time. Bye!